I'm very happy to welcome Thea Riofrancos to speak to us today. Thea is, in my estimation, one of the most important voices today thinking about the relationship between climate and global justice. And she does that by connecting that conversation to issues of labor, resource extraction, and political systems. Thea successfully combines activism and advocacy with original scholarship. To hit just the highlights so that we can get to the main event, Thea is Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College, with a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She's had multiple fellowships, most recently, 2-year Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. She's the author of Resource Radicals from Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, and co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and is at work on a book called Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism, the title of her talk today. So I think we're getting a preview of the argument to come there. Shorter writings have appeared in Dissent, Jacobin, and N+1, aka the leftist trifecta, and the sign of a healthy and ecumenical leftist mind, as well as The Guardian, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. We are delighted to have her join us today, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Riofrancos to the Havens Wright Center.
Thank you so much, Patrick, and it's a pleasure to see you again. And I am going to share my screen so that we can get started, because we have a pretty substantive conversation today, and I'm super excited to also hear questions from the audience later on. So let me share this slideshow. Here we go. All right. So as mentioned, I will be presenting today on my in-progress book. I'm through with the vast majority of the field work and research. I'm sort of halfway through writing it, we might say. So that's kind of where I'm at to give you a sense. And so I'm very open to feedback. And I'm also working on various related projects. So any feedback or engagement is great. I'm still in the process of thinking through all of this. So let me situate us a little bit in the place where this all began. In January of 2019, I traveled to Chile, a place that I had not previously done research, but in a region where I've done a lot of research, over a decade of research in Latin America on conflicts surrounding oil and mining sectors. So I wasn't new to extraction, but I was new to Chile, and I was new to studying lithium specifically. And I found myself in a really unusual set of landscapes, a really vibrant set of communities and social movements and other types of political demands around lithium, which, as we'll see, is a really central ingredient in the renewable energy transition. Chile is the #2 global producer of lithium, and all of Chile's lithium currently comes from the Atacama Salt Flat, which is in the Atacama Desert, which is the oldest and driest desert on Earth, and a really, as I said, kind of beautiful landscape that we'll see more of in a moment. So this is me standing on the Atacama Salt Flat, about 30 kilometers or 19 miles from very large lithium extractive installations that are on this salt flat and that suck out the lithium from underneath this ground that we're looking at. As we can also see, this is home to some amazing endemic species, such as 2 different types of flamingos that are native to the area and that are snacking on smaller organisms that are in these salty lagoons on the surface of the salt flat. The salt flat is also ringed by towering Andean mountains, some of which are volcanic, so hence the kind of dramatic features of the area. There are also 18 indigenous communities, Atacameño communities, that live around the salt flat and that engage in a variety of livelihoods, including small and medium-scale agriculture, some of which you see displayed here, with some pretty ingenious and ancestral forms of irrigation that make the most of water in a water-scarce environment. So these are the different activities that coexist around the salt flat, in addition to a very large copper sector, which might come up in today's talk a bit. Once I left Chile and sort of started to do other forms of research on lithium, I realized that this was a much bigger story, right? Chile is still central in my study and in my book, but I started to learn about all of the different mining and extractive requirements in order to build a renewable energy transition. Whether copper, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earths, all of these plays a role in electrifying transportation, in building wind turbines and transmission lines and solar panels, all of these technologies we need in order to get off of fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy. The issue is that they require lots of new forms of resource extraction, some older and some newer, but expanded. And so that's kind of a graph that we're looking at right now. And just to sort of flag, I will be focused primarily on lithium, though I'm happy to talk about other things, within the boundaries of my expertise. So why focus on lithium? Lithium is, as I said, a really crucial ingredient in electrifying transportation. That's because it's currently a non-substitutable element in lithium-ion batteries, and those batteries are the preferred technology for especially ground transportation. So we're looking at electric vehicles, electric buses, electric bikes, electric trucks. All of those have lithium-ion batteries in them, and all those batteries have lithium in them. It's also, by the way, used, the larger versions of those batteries, I should say, are also important on energy grids where you need to calibrate supply and demand of variable renewable energy like wind and sun and store it temporarily before it needs to be used. And so that lithium plays a role there as well. It's found in a wide range of deposits and is actually relatively geologically abundant, right? So we're going to hear a lot of talk from politicians in a moment being scared that there's not enough of it. It is geologically abundant. However, as many folks know who may study extractive sectors in this room, the sort of map of deposits is distinct from the map of where it's actually extracted and processed. And it is territorially concentrated. There are just a few countries, Australia, Chile, Argentina, and China, that provide the vast majority of the world's lithium currently, though as we'll see, that might change soon. That kind of discrepancy between territorial concentration and growing demand is already causing an imbalance between supply and demand. So just to get into things a little bit more and to, again, lay out the basic context of lithium before moving into more sophisticated kind of political economy conversation, lithium is projected to grow quite dramatically in terms of the demand for lithium and the market for lithium. Of all of the different critical minerals that the International Energy Agency forecasts for, lithium sees the highest growth. And so what this graph is showing us is that compared to 2020, in 2040, we'll need 42 times, as much lithium as is currently demanded, right? And so a huge growth in that market. And just, it's a little bit of a complex graph, but the basics of it on the right are telling us that a lot of that demand is being propelled by one particular use of lithium, which is electric vehicles, right? So you can think of Teslas, Nissan Leafs, you can think of the e-Hummer or the e-SUVs that are coming on market. Those passenger electric vehicles are increasingly the top consumer of lithium, and therefore the top reason that new lithium mines are being built. So I want to say something at the outset, because this often emerges in sort of public talks that I give, understandably, and I want to sort of front load it and just speak to it very quickly, and I can return to it in Q&A as needed. I do want to be clear that there's a forecast for very large increases in the minerals that we need for energy transition technologies. And as I sort of noted at the outset, each of these mines has concrete impacts, right? In Chile, for example, and we'll see some other places later on in the talk. The scale of mining for critical minerals is much less than what we currently extract for fossil fuel production, right? So in a world in which we totally leave fossil fuels behind and transition to green energy, we will be mining less. However, I do think that this side-by-side comparison, which there's a lot of recently for those of you that sort of follow the climate and energy news, is not that helpful for two reasons. One is these are coexisting. We're still in a fossil fuel energy system, and the mines for the next energy system are already being built. So we have like a lot of extraction going on simultaneously for two different kind of energy systems that are currently still coexisting side by side. And the other thing is that even if the volumes of total extraction are less, every single mine matters in terms of its local impacts, but also, as we'll see, in terms of the increasingly tense geopolitics around these supply chains. But again, I do want to be clear that when we look at extractive volumes, completely leaving fossil fuels in the ground would be a net benefit. We would decrease total volumes of extraction. Again, happy to return to that in Q&A. So let's zoom in, though, a little bit more. What do we mean when we say we need a lot more lithium? There are a lot of different ways to measure demand. We can do, metric tons. We can do percentages. I think an interesting way to think about it is discrete mines, because when we look at local environmental and social impacts, or when we look at government policies that are trying to incentivize mining, we're talking about, one individual mine kind of at a time, right? And so lots more mines are projected to be necessary in order to meet global demand for lithium in just the coming decade, right? So in 2035, a little more than 10 years out from now, one of the main forecasting agencies says that in addition to the 40 mines that already exist, some of which are kind of small actually and not major producers, but anyway, in addition to the 40 mines that already exist, we would need 59 to 74 new lithium mines. So that's a huge increase. And that's just in 12 years, and mines can take that long or sometimes longer to be built, right? So for all those reasons, because many more mines are projected to be needed, primarily for feedstock for electric vehicles, and because mines take a while to build, we're already in a situation of a supply-demand imbalance. What that means in less technical terms is that supply is not keeping up with rapidly growing demand. That is putting upward pressure on prices, which is important because increasingly raw materials are shaping the prices of those batteries, and those batteries are the main component of an electric vehicle. So if we want affordable, accessible electric vehicles, that's another reason to sort of care about this overall picture. But I sort of want to pivot now to what I promised, which is a more nuanced conversation of political economy. Lithium and critical minerals for the energy transition is not just a matter of supply and demand, as I've sort of been presenting it over the last few slides, in isolation from politics or social concerns, right? In fact, these really intense questions of how many lithium mines will be built, how are supply chains going to be structured, who benefits and who pays the cost? And I don't just mean economic benefits and economic costs, but social and environmental and climate benefits and social and environmental costs, right? Are there alternatives that would be more just than rapidly expanding extractive sectors? What are the different visions on the table about how we are going to organize the energy transition? And how does looking at the resource extraction required kind of broaden our view of what the energy transition even is, right? And I think of this as the contentious and still very emergent and nascent. So we're kind of in the thick of history or in the thick of the future, however we want to think about it, this contentious emergent political economy of green technologies. And, the way I analyze it, being a political scientist, but also someone very influenced by other social science and humanities disciplines, from sociology to anthropology to history to heterodox economics, I kind of look at this political economy as organized by interaction. So it's a relational political economy between three distinct sets of actors. One is governments, the second is firms, and the third is social movements. And we're going to see how each play a role in structuring the overall kind of political economy of these supply chains. They do so asymmetrically. I do not claim that multinational corporations and local social movements have the same power, but we will see that movements actually have some power, even as they contend with actors that have more resources than they do. I won't attend to it as much today, but it'll sort of pop up, and it already has a little bit in my talk. I also want to acknowledge that there's another actor, which is non-human nature, right? And whenever we look at extractive sectors, the kind of geology of them, the climate and ecology surrounding them, the watersheds that they might interact with, the turbulent weather that might sometimes make mining more difficult or exacerbate some of the impacts of mining, these are all also important, right? I'm going to focus more on human actors, but non-human nature is extremely relevant throughout this talk. So let me just quickly signal to the academics in the room that care about methods and what the empirical basis of this is, I'll just kind of give a quick overview of what all this research is based on. I already said that I was in Chile in 2019. I've since been back during a very momentous moment in Chile of rewriting a constitution and a left-wing government, and that pertained a lot to mining politics, which I can talk about in the Q&A. I've also kind of pushed my own boundaries as a scholar that primarily focuses on Latin America in my past, but now I'm incorporating Europe and the US, and we will see why in the next few slides. But I've been to the European Union headquarters, to Spain and Portugal, but also in the US to Nevada for field work on this project. I do in-person, in situ ethnography as well as virtual, with the pandemic kind of rejiggering some of our methods. And I've conducted a whole host of interviews and engaged in archival and media analysis as well. So as I said, three key actors that we're going to focus on today, and I'm going to start with governments. Not just because I'm a political scientist, but because particularly in extractive sectors, states, state agencies, state actors play a really important role. These are resources that are in the jurisdiction of a given state's territory. In many cases, especially in the global south, but though not exclusively, states are the technical owners of subsoil resources, and they may directly be contracting with multinational corporations. So governments are important in the global south as well as in the global north, as I'll turn to right now. So let's go to the global north. As I said, I've studied Latin America for a long time, but this research brought me to global north societies as well. And so it started in Europe, and I've since done similar research in the US, where I noticed that more and more global north governments didn't want to do what they had done before, which is just kind of continually import extractive materials from the rest of the world, often the global south, though not exclusively. But instead, they were increasingly talking about onshoring or reshoring or sort of regionalizing those supply chains and saying, we should produce our own lithium or copper or whatever it is and not rely on these supply chains that the pandemic has shown to be vulnerable. This shift actually began a bit before the pandemic, but it's accelerated a lot since, as well as since Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the way that's affected global supply chains. So long story short, in order to understand lithium, I didn't want to just stay in Latin America because more and more of the conversation about lithium and the actual mining of it was potentially moving elsewhere. And so, I developed an analytic framework to sort of take stock of this situation, which is published. It says 2022, though actually that's when it went online, but it was published in the winter issue of 2023 of Global Environmental Politics, if folks want to check it out. But it's called the Security Sustainability Nexus. And what I'm referring to there is a set of policies and also rhetorical justifications for why all of these European and US and Canadian governments are so interested in onshoring lithium mining and no longer just importing it, but alongside importing it, also producing it domestically. And I wanted to understand why that was the case. I want to just define quickly what this is, and then I'll kind of set up the puzzle a little bit. So what I mean is a set of very corporate-friendly industrial policies. I mean subsidies, direct investments, making the regulations faster, helping different firms coordinate amongst themselves. So they're corporate-friendly industrial policies that seek to expand lithium mining within the US and EU in this case. There's also an interesting rhetorical and to some extent policy focus on the sustainability and responsibility of that mining, saying we'll do it better here than it's done elsewhere in the global south or in China or whatever the contrast is. Why is this puzzling? And so I'm not assuming that anyone in the room, aside from me, is like a mining geek. So I'll sort of set up a little bit why it's puzzling. Mining is the very beginning of supply chains. That means it's the least value added node. As we go down the supply chain towards refining and manufacturing and the end use technologies, we add more value and actually more profit and more technological sophistication. So it's not clear why, so-called advanced economies would want to onshore this early node of production. It's also environmentally impactful. It has a really egregious record of human rights violations. Therefore, it's socially contentious and politically risky. So again, Why, if you've, imported lithium or copper from Chile or Peru, like why onshore that? And the trend has really been offshoring for the past 50 or 100 years from, away mining, leaving the US and going elsewhere. In the meantime, of course, China has emerged both as a major domestic miner as well as a major importer of some of these critical minerals. These are exactly the trends that US and EU policymakers want to transform. They don't want to rely as much on imports, and they also don't want to rely as much on imports that kind of route through China. China imports lithium and then processes it, and a lot of it ends up in the batteries that are used around the world. So why is this? Why the pivot? First and foremost, as I just said, there's a desire to contest or contain China's economic ascent. This desire predates the pandemic, but was really accelerated by it. And as I said, by some recent geopolitical events that have shed light on supply chains and on the fact that a lot of them route through China. And this is newly kind of seen as a problem by policymakers in the US and Europe. The other thing is that these claims to it being more responsible or sustainable to mine in the West has an interesting sort of geopolitical or geoeconomic angle, which is, we can sort of maybe sell at a premium resources mined under better conditions and sort of outcompete China in this way, because we can't outcompete China maybe on pure economic cost or on scale, but we can outcompete with more responsible sourcing. So this is kind of what policymakers are saying. Corporations, though, are also interested in this onshoring dynamic. For auto companies, as I said, are kind of facing the supply crunch where they're concerned about not enough supply of lithium and it getting more expensive to buy it, will welcome anything that encourages more lithium mining. And that's exactly what these state policies set out to do. Lithium mining companies, of course, love state loans and financing and de-risking that makes their operations more profitable and less risky. So both notes that the supply chain firms like these policies because they are corporate friendly overall. And they also benefit from the US government or the Canadian or European government saying minerals from our countries are more ethical, because all of these firms face scrutiny over their sourcing. And so if they can say we source from the US and it's more sustainable, that is also a benefit to them in terms of reputational capital. This has manifested in really real, this is not just talk. These are really real policy pivots that range from executive orders to laws to regulations to new institutions to public financing of research and development and to direct public financing in the forms of venture capital, loans, subsidies of the mining sector in the US and Europe. The most recent news here, I'll just kind of go down to the bottom right corner, is that the Department of Energy has loaned $700 million to an Australian lithium producer that has a US project in Nevada, and also has promised to cover up to 75% of the capital costs for another project through loans. And so, you get the idea. The Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the US, a bunch of new policy developments in the EU are opening up lots of financing for the mining sector and lots of encouragement for mines to be built within their jurisdictions. This is having very real effect. We are actually seeing a redrawing of the map of lithium extraction. And this is just a sort of example of this. This is, I cite my source here because he's done excellent work compiling this map, which is actually quite challenging. Information about extractive sectors tends to be very opaque, so it's actually hard to create a map like this. This is 112 lithium projects at some stage of permitting or financing or development. None of them have received every permit yet, but they're all at some stage of that process. 112 of them just in the Western US alone, so just in a handful of states that do have large lithium deposits, but there's actually projects elsewhere in the US that this isn't capturing, for example, in North Carolina. So we're redrawing the map of lithium. The US has lots of projects in early stages and some actually almost at the end of the permitting process. In the European Union, similarly in Spain, Portugal, Germany, we have new projects being announced or at various levels of permitting and financing near the EU, in Serbia, or formerly in the EU, in the UK. You get the idea. The global north is encouraging lithium mining within its borders, and it's changing where extraction is happening. And this will only grow as more and more financing is allocated. However, I want to just complexify in a way what I just said and go back to my roots as someone that studies the global South and Latin America specifically, which is that the growth of mining in the global North does not displace the global South. In fact, lots of projects are being announced there, and there's existing mining there, right? And so I have a list of where we have some recent project announcements, as well as, again, some of our top players in the current mining, lithium mining market are in Latin America. And so what we have is what scholars call unequal ecological exchange. So the sort of drain of resources and the impacts that they leave behind from the global South to the global North, that continues, while at the same time, the extractive frontier expands within the global North and to new places in the global South. This is a planetary mine, a term I borrow from Martin Arboleda, and I'll return to later on. So let's go to firms, because I've already suggested that the policies from the states, though they do involve more state intervention, they're very corporate friendly. And so how are capitalists responding to these new policies? They're reaping benefits, they're making announcements of new investments. The public investments help them attract new private investment, right? So it's definitely a boom for them. And they also kind of have similar discourses as well as strategies that pertain to those two pillars of security of supply and sustainability of supply. And so on the first part, in terms of supply chain security, we see firms doing a host of things to ensure that they have access to this critical mineral. They are entering into long-term contracts, so automakers contracting with lithium mines. Their automakers and lithium miners are joining together. In some cases, auto companies are directly investing in lithium mines. That's a kind of blast for the past of like Fordism and earlier moments in global capitalism. And so we have these strategies for automakers and battery makers to make sure that they have dibs on the existing and near-term future supply. This is a chart that I pulled from the Financial Times, and I want to just flag that this is one of 6 pages. So, and this is from a few months ago, so it's actually, there's more examples now that aren't even listed here. But the idea is that there are lots and lots of new ways in which automakers are directly ensuring that they get lithium supply in ways that kind of, we could say, tighten the chain, meaning they bring the end of the chain, the automakers, into more direct economic relationship with the beginning of the chain, the miners, which on the one hand, of course, increases the chances that the automakers get the lithium they need, but also we could start to think about it might expose them to more risk. If there's a strike or a protest at a mine that Tesla or GM has invested in, they are more associated with that reputational harm, and also their supplies may be impacted, right? So there's pros and cons to this strategy. But GM is the big recent news. General Motors invested $650 million in a lithium company for its Thacker Pass mine in Nevada, right? So that's, again, going along with this, bringing mining to the US and also directly investing in mines from an auto company. At the same time, and often in the same kind of corporate sort of public relations statements that they are announcing these investments in mines, they're also increasingly emphasizing sustainable sourcing. So the mining companies say, we're responsible, we're sustainable, et cetera. And the auto companies also say, we only want responsible, sustainable sources. They do feel that they are under more scrutiny from civil society, from the government, potentially, though some of the government's not scrutinizing them that much. There's, of course, environmental agencies that might, and from so-called ESG investors that want to invest in things with social or environmental benefits. So, all of this emphasis on sustainable sourcing also opens up the risk for greenwashing. Like, how do we know that the mineral supply chains are really sustainable, right? And so that's something that we can talk about in Q&A. So now I want to be relational. I said it's a relational terrain of different actors that are asymmetrically related to one another, but are interacting in a sort of ongoing manner. And so I want to bring our government and corporate strategies together. What are some of the tensions and contradictions of green capitalism? I've actually noted a lot of points of collaboration, but there are also some tensions between state goals in the US and EU and on corporate goals. One is that all of this emphasis on China being the enemy and this sort of new Cold War with China and wanting to actually decouple supply chains from China, which the recent climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, starts to make some headway towards, as does the recent semiconductor legislation, the CHIPS Act. Both of them disincentivize in various ways supply chains that route through China. But this is costly for firms, to sort of rebuild supply chains or build parallel supply chains or dismantle supply chains. That's costly. They may not like that. Even if they have to say, it's good, for public relations purposes, they may internally actually not be thrilled about that. Sustainability is also a realm of contradictions where everyone, state and corporate, public and private sector, says we want more sustainable supplies. But at the end of the day, firms don't want to be forced to do something. So they prefer these kind of voluntary corporate statements or initiatives, or they've joined a sustainable mining association, but they don't want actual regulation that forces them to be more sustainable. So there are tensions. There are competing goals of national security, of environmental sustainability, of corporate profitability, all in the midst of an urgent, rapid need to confront climate change and move forward with an energy transition. So it's this domain of collaboration and conflicts in which green capitalism, by which I mean a capitalism in which there's major investment in renewable energy and other so-called green sectors, is being forged. But as I said at the outset, I am not only concerned with elite actors. Empirically, we actually see that actors that are non-elite, grassroots organizations, directly affected communities, some of the transnational activist networks, and also international non-governmental organizations that connect, support, and act in solidarity with those frontline communities are actually helping to themselves reshape supply chains, just as governments and firms are doing. So there are social movements increasingly at the sites of extraction for renewable energy related mining, lithium being one key example, though there are also protests in other mining sectors related to the energy transition. This emphasis from the part of global North governments and corporations on secure supplies and sustainable supplies is interacting with these burgeoning movements. The first way it's interacted is that expanding lithium mining in the global North is changing not just the map of mining, but by that same token, the map of protest. So whereas, a decade ago, let's say, protest against lithium mining, against its impacts on water systems, on habitats and species, on indigenous rights, were primarily in Chile and Argentina, now we see explosions of protests elsewhere. Portugal, Serbia, the US, in multiple places in the US, right? Spain, we've seen protests in the global North because the mining is moving to the global North. I don't want to say moving. It's not like it's leaving the global South, but it's expanding towards the global North as well. So that's one way that these three actors are interacting together. And I want to give you a kind of sense of what this protest looks like, right? I think it's always quite interesting as someone that's studied extractive related protests for a long time, first in Latin America and now in other places in the world, that we always have really locally specific concerns about, let's say, the impact of lithium mining in a desert that's already water vulnerable in Chile, right? Or whether we have the concerns, and you'll see more photos in a moment on this, in Portugal, of the way that lithium mining, in that case, hard rock mining, might impact agricultural livelihoods that currently predominate, right? There's always specific impacts. But what's also interesting is we see patterns. We see, again, those effects on the water system, effects on biodiversity, effects on indigenous rights or the rights of other land-based or place-based peoples. And we see the effects on alternative livelihoods, such as farming, being frequent grievances about mining in general and about lithium mining in particular. I want to just bring us now to Portugal and Nevada, places I went over the past year, where I was able to witness landscapes that have not yet been mined. So these are sites of mines that have not yet been constructed yet. And it's possible may not happen if protest and regulation work in tandem enough to stall them or stop them, but they also may happen. It's an open question at this point. That the mine on the right, or the photos on the right of the site of Thacker Pass, is again what the Department of Energy just said will fund a lot of that capital investment. So these are places that state actors are actively incentivizing to be mined. The same mine that General Motors invested in, right? So there's a lot of pressure to build this mine, but there's also lawsuits and protest against it. And on the left, we have Portugal and the agricultural community where the mine would be built. And so what's the impact of all of this? I've already kind of mentioned that we will see, in some cases, processes of permitting or financing of mines be slowed down or stalled. Of course, from the state and corporate actors' perspective, this is a big problem because it might deepen the supply crunch. I don't think it's the main cause of the supply crunch, and I can answer questions about that. But from their perspective, it's a problem for that reason, right? So this might actually incentivize state actors to double down, to use forms of repression in order to advance these projects, or they might be forced to listen to civil society. It really depends on the context, right? But I think, again, like the bigger picture of all of this social movement activity around these supply chains is increasing pattern of shared grievances, a lot of coordination that actually cuts across that north-south kind of global binary. And so we're seeing folks in Nevada talk to folks in Chile and people in Portugal. And, across the divide of global inequality, where we kind of place the US and Europe on top and, other countries on the bottom, a lot of these activists realize that they have a lot in common because they tend to be marginalized people in rural communities. These are also indigenous people in the United States or in Canada, right? And they may see a lot in common with indigenous communities in the rest of the Americas, or the kind of place-based, land-based communities in Portugal, while not indigenous, that wouldn't be the word that we would use, rely a lot on small and medium scale farming like the folks in Chile, right? And so they're seeing these resonances and sharing their knowledge and tactics across borders. But it also kind of offers a forceful rebuke of the idea that mining is automatically more responsible if it happens in the global north, something I am very happy to talk about more if what my thoughts are on that question. And lastly, we see a lot of interesting ideas and innovative kind of policy suggestions, often kind of starting in Latin America and kind of percolating to other movements. So these demands that the rights of nature should be recognized, where Latin America is a leader in that. More than one Latin American constitution and country recognizes that. The idea of indigenous consent is more actually firmly recognized in Latin America than the US, for example. Even more radical ideas like, should we nationalize this? Should it be all in the public domain? What do labor rights look like? A lot of those innovative ideas have sort of come from the Americas and are now kind of spreading also elsewhere in the world. And I want to just end my talk and then really looking forward to Q&A with a kind of pivot. I just have one more slide after this, and I want to sort of bring things full circle. So I've just mentioned a bunch of different innovative policy ideas and civil society proposals that pertain to protecting vulnerable landscapes and people from the worst forms of extraction, and also re-envisioning what governance of extraction might look like. So those are initiatives on the supply side, meaning in the places where mining is occurring or planned to occur. But what about the other end? Way at the beginning of my talk, I said, the main driver for all this new lithium mining is the electric vehicles that are being produced in more and more, greater and greater numbers, in order to, of course, decarbonize the transportation sector, which in the U.S. is the number one contributor to our emissions footprint. So it's very important to deal with. But is there a way to decarbonize or to cut emissions from transportation that both meets climate goals rapidly and equitably, while at the same time not requiring so much mining? And this is my last slide here, and I'm sort of giving it a little short shrift, but I'm happy to talk about it more. It's a policy paper that I just put out with a think tank that I work with and co-authored with a team at University of California, Davis, where we actually dig into the numbers and look at, is there a way to completely eliminate emissions from U.S. transportation with less mining than the worst forecast, right? Not with no mining, not with zero lithium mining, but with less than the most concerning forecasts about how many new mines need to be built. And the answer is yes. If we can, at the same time that we cut emissions from our transportation sector, encourage non-car forms of transportation like transit, walking, and cycling, if we can make our batteries less gargantuan, just to note, US EV batteries are like twice the global average in size and thus require much more lithium because we like our ESUVs, or at least the car companies like them because they're very profitable. So if we can just rethink in a variety of ways, like how we are decarbonizing transportation, there's an opportunity to make a transportation sector that meets climate goals, that offers more equitable and accessible mobility, and also does not dramatically increase how many lithium ions we need on this planet. So with that, I will end it, and I'm super looking forward to questions. I hope I didn't go over time too much. And yeah, happy to hear what folks want to ask or comment on as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Thea. That was a really excellent lecture, very rich for our impending discussion and Q&A. I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. There are 2 ways that you can ask a question. First, you can raise your hand virtually, and to do that, just click on the bottom of your screen on the reactions button to raise your hand, and then I will call on your name. Alternatively, you can type your question into the chat if you prefer, and I will read it out loud. But if you do intend to ask your question yourself, please turn on your video so Thea can address you directly. So the floor is open. And we have Samaya, I apologize if I am mispronouncing your first name, but you are first. So please take it away.
So firstly, I'm not Samaya, I'm the husband of Samaya. So both of us taking the time to hear this wonderful, informative presentation and talk, and that was really amazing. Thank you, Tia. So your pronunciation of the name of my wife is quite good and professional. So that is correct, Adriana. Okay, so Tia, I'm not coming from the academic field of that could possibly match your principle. So I'm coming from the background of social science. So my question is quite something about the terminology that you've used with that. So you've used the term sustainability, which comes to my mind that sustainability for that sort of economic pattern or something like this could be defined on a cycle. So without some sort of steps, just like reprocessing and waste management and so on, sustainability of capitalizing something and then sourcing something could not be possibly a correct term for that. So the term that is used seems to me a little bit challengeable to use in its context. So it could be some sort of sustainable sourcing for the whole market, but without reprocessing lithium, that could not be the case. So that's what the first one. The second one is the term that is quite related to the concept of reprocessing. All you've talked about is about mining. So what is the trend what is the trend for waste management and reprocessing of lithium? If there is any kind of reprocessing research project or something like that could affect on the political side and the economist side of the market, that could also be my interest. And what is the trend for that? That is 2 of my questions.
Thank you so much. Those are great questions. So I want to answer both of them, though they're kind of related as you also frame them as such. And my background is also in social science for what it is. I sometimes veer into some energy wonkery, but otherwise I'm with you in terms of our academic backgrounds. I completely agree with the first point in the question, meaning and I actually often put scare quotes around the word sustainable. I guess I neglected to here, hence maybe triggering your question in the article I'm pulling from. I'm pretty careful about that because it's a claim, right? It's not a reality. It may or may not, be even a possible reality, but it's definitely a claim. And so, I'll say just a couple of quick things here. One is I think it's noteworthy that governments in the global north and corporations, oftentimes but not always headquartered in the global north, are talking so much about sustainability. That talk may be cheap, it may be greenwashing, it may be meaningfulist, it may be symbolic. I'm, more than willing to probably say that a lot of it is, right? But I still think it's a shift that so many companies are talking about it and that governments are talking about it as something like a competitive angle, so-called, that the West holds over China, is that we are more responsible and sustainable. And so, why are they talking about it so much? Even just to explain that discursive phenomena, I think is interesting, because every supply chain observer and mining and auto industry observer I've interviewed said it is new. It is new, the amount of focus, right? So that's one thing. But absolutely scare quotes around the term in part, as your question signals to, because I don't actually think that mining, in terms of new mining of deposits underground, can be sustainable just logically because it's a non-renewable resource, right? Meaning there's only so much underground. We're not at a scarcity point right now, but it's weird to call something sustainable if it has a finite limit. And it's also weird to call something sustainable when even like the most well-managed mines can have some pretty severe environmental and social impacts, in addition to just needing to displace lots of land used for other things, whether communities, habitats, or other livelihoods for the mine. Mines are enormous, modern mines. And so what does sustainable really mean in this context? Yes, I actually think it's not the best term to use. I just am talking about the way actors are using it. I'm going to move on to your second question, which I think is extremely astute, which is that one way to make mining maybe less harmful, or maybe better put, to reduce the amount of mining needed, is to make it more circular, meaning at the end of the process, or even before the end of the process, you convert waste into new materials, right? So that can happen from the get-go, like on the factory floor of a battery manufacturer, there's all these scraps that can be sort of repurposed. And that's one form of recycling. But later on, after the battery is used, let's say there's a decade of use in a car, and afterwards it comes to its end of life, all of that can be recovered. Like 95 or 99% of lithium can be recovered from a battery. The question right now is making companies do that, because actually right now it's still cheaper to mine than to recover lithium. That might change just due to market dynamics, but really we need to force through regulations companies to recycle those batteries, and then the companies on the other end to use that recovered material rather than new mining material. And the EU is actually making strides on both those fronts to require that. But yes, I think thinking about a more circular economy, thinking about waste management at every stage, reducing the waste, but also reusing what's valuable in the waste is critical here. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Great. Thea, we have two questions in the chat. The first is from Peter Blankenheim. What are the prospects for technical breakthroughs away from lithium at this time? And the second from Don Weichert. Apologies, Don, if I'm saying your last name incorrectly. What are the U.S. sustainability and labor restrictions on lithium and other mineral use in the IRA and Infrastructure Acts? We'll leave it at those two, and then we'll take two questions from our audience directly after your responses.
Great, excellent, really great questions. So substitutions for lithium. Absolutely. There are just now some, if I'd given this talk like 2 months ago, my answer would have been different. And I just say that because the field is fast moving in some ways, though there's also a lot of sunk costs in existing lithium supply chains. So we can sometimes have developments that are like, wow, new invention, but still, a lot of the supply chain might stay the same and those things can coexist. But the newest thing that is getting more commercially viable is sodium batteries. And that has the advantage of a cheaper raw material, sodium compared to lithium, and some other actual advantages around the safety of those batteries and not exploding, which sometimes lithium batteries do. And also that I have to research this more, so I don't want to go too on the record with something that I'm still researching, but my sense is that sodium, acquiring sodium can be less environmentally impactful than lithium, but I'm not actually sure that that's the case. I need to research it more. It's certainly cheaper, and there's certainly a lot of it, very abundant in the earth, and ocean. So sodium batteries are a possibility. The downsides of them are that they are less energy dense than lithium batteries, and sometimes that's compensated for by making a battery pack, which is the way that batteries appear in our electric vehicles. It's lots of individual cells put together in a pack. So some of them could be lithium and some are sodium. That way you get the benefits of the sodium with the energy density of the lithium. But you get the idea. People are interested in new non-lithium based battery technologies because of reasons of cost, or sometimes because of reasons of environmental impact or reasons of availability. But there's also been a tremendous amount of investment in lithium mines, and more is being forecast. And so I'm a little unsure how whether there'll be a competitor that really displaces lithium, whether again they'll be side by side, but the high price of lithium, I would say, is one of the main reasons that we're seeing new research and development of other commercially viable battery technologies. So that's the first question. The second, what regulatory standards do we have in recent U.S. legislation, like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act? What recent standards do we have that address some of the concerns that I've surfaced and that activists raise around labor standards, environmental standards, social governance standards, all of that kind of stuff? And the answer is not very much. There's really not a ton in either of those pieces of legislation that pertains to ensuring that the governance of these mines is as best as it can be. In the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's really nothing on that front. What there is, though, related to actually our earlier question, is incentives for recycling. So for new recycling plants to be built, or for new recycling technologies to be developed, right? So that's the sort of range of sustainability focus in the Infrastructure Act is incentivizing recycling. In the IRA, not very much. There was an initial idea early before it got whittled down that there would be labor standards attached to electric vehicle batteries, attached to everything that goes into making those batteries. Those got dropped. There isn't any environmental standards in there for anything that we're throwing lots of public money around. There's some labor benefits on other parts of the supply chain, but not really pertaining to mining. So the answer is not enough. But the last answer is that we just saw news yesterday or the day before that the Biden administration is moving to retroactively put some conditionalities on the CHIPS Act, which is a similar piece of legislation, but related to semiconductors. And they're making companies that receive federal money have childcare for their workers, right? And so you can retroactively put in standards, but it gets hard to legislate them currently with the GOP in power in Congress.
Great, thank you, Thea. Andy, Bruno, you please, ask your question.
First off, thanks for this fascinating talk. I really, really appreciated learning all of this stuff. I wanted to ask, because I've noticed, and maybe this is unfair, but I feel like I've noticed sort of trajectory in your let's say these three books. So like A Planet to Win was much more pro, energy transition, like deep investment in a lot of this stuff. Resource Radicals was much more looking at the anti-extractivist debates and contentions and all of that. And here you're kind of sort of putting down with the anti-extractivist framework. Is that a fair way to characterize it? And just sort of more broadly, I'd be interested to hear about sort of the trajectory of your thinking over these projects, about sort of how to do an energy transition, how to create a sustainability that is actually has teeth, not is, white greenwashing, and all of that.
Wow. I'm first of all flattered by the question and the attention to some of the work I put out, and also the nuanced kind of reading of different kind of dealing with different facets of extractive sectors and the energy transition and the climate crisis, and maybe kind of emphasizing different problems and opportunities with them. But let me tell you how I think about it, and because I do kind of try to step back and think, like, how do these different projects relate to one another? I'm going to say one just statement at the beginning, and then I'll go to exactly what you asked about, which is that I remain like super in favor of a rapid and equitable energy transition. Nothing I've learned about lithium changes my mind that we need to leave every single ton of fossil fuels underground and all the carbon that they would emit to not be emitted, and that we need to rapidly transition to renewable energy, which is going to require new build out of a variety of pieces of infrastructure and technology, not just in the US, of course, around the world. And those build outs will have environmental footprints and social governance questions that are raised that need to be dealt with in a way that is as equitable as possible and also as in line with the climate science as possible, right? So that position hasn't changed. What I've actually kind of learned more and more, and I kind of gestured to this at the very end of the talk, is like how connected the beginning and the end of the supply chain are, meaning it really matters how we design the green, I'm just using that term because I know I don't want to greenwash myself, but like the renewable energy sectors, right? How we design those. How do we design our energy system, our housing system, our transportation system, our agricultural system? All of these systems need to be redesigned in order to mitigate, adapt, transition with the climate crisis and with the energy transition, right? And the way that we design each of those sectors doesn't just have dramatic implications for the people that use those built environments in the locality, right? But it also has dramatic implications for the beginning of the supply chain, which might be very far away. So just to say, like, if we have a transportation system that's zero emissions and in which we get some Americans out of their cars and into e-bikes and into walking and e-buses, and reduce vehicle ownership rates in the US, or we just make our vehicles less, e-Hummer sized and more like normal size, people in Chile benefit. I mean, it's a lot of steps in between to make that argument, but we don't need as much lithium. There's less of a scramble. There's less of this coordinated capitalist like state push to like incentivize mining quickly because less overall is needed, right? So that's kind of how I think about it. But I'm going to answer your question in one other quick way, and then I'll because this is something I could talk about a lot, and it's a really fruitful points that you've raised. But just one other thing I want to add is that the way I see resource radicals and my current book project and kind of A Planet to Win is kind of almost like in a bridge between them in a way, even though it came out anyway, the order of publication is not the order of working on them, right? So that's kind of how I see it. And and A Planet to Win, we do talk about lithium and in the final chapter. So we start to address these issues there. But I love working on extractive sectors, as harmful as they are, as dangerous as they can be, as environmentally toxic and socially contentious as they are. They're also the places where you can kind of just get into the nitty-gritty of what global capitalism looks like on the ground, and also see some of the most, in my view, inspiring movements for like a different kind of economic order entirely, and maybe even like a different relationship to nature, most ambitiously. And so I think they're fascinating to study. And in my kind of two books, the current one and Resource Radicals, the solo authored books, two sets of dilemmas emerge, and they interact, but they are distinct. One is, if you're in the global South, what do you do with the legacy of colonial and neo-colonial extraction? Do you put it under public or state or worker or nationalized control, but not stop extraction, just make it the ownership and the economic benefits different? Or do you end extraction? And those were like the two visions in Resource Radicals, but it's a dilemma specific to governments fate with kind of progressive constituencies in dependent kind of positions in the global economy that are kind of caught in a difficult position in that way. In my current book, it's more about what do we do about the mining required to address climate change? That's a different dilemma. But I mean, in a way, they interact and intersect. Actually, if you're in Chile, they certainly intersect. But these are the types of dilemmas that extraction poses, because extraction as a sector kind of reminds us of our earthly kind of dependence, right? And of the materiality of all production. And there are better and worse ways to do it, but I don't think there's escaping that earthly kind of situation. And so I think a lot of interesting policy proposals can be brought up, but that's how I think about it. Sorry for a slightly long answer, but big question. And I hope that was interesting to folks that haven't read any of my work yet.
No apologies needed, Thea. Thank you so much for the wonderful question. Andy, next we'll go to Diane Thiele.
Hi, I'm a retired auto worker, so I kind of want to deal with the other end.
Yes.
From the time of the 2008 crisis, I was part of a group, auto worker caravan, and we put forward the idea that the US government should actually take over a GM and Chrysler because they were bailing them out, and set up worker, government, and community-controlled plants that would be for mass transit, because we don't have mass transit in this country. I live in Detroit, and we don't even. We just don't have anything. So of course that didn't go anywhere, and right now, actually. I'm involved in a caucus that's fighting for control of the UAW, and the ballots are being counted as we speak. But I wanted to mention that a lot of these battery plants are opening up in the United States. There's one that's opening up in Marshall, Michigan, And I noticed that, and I think this is also important to understand, that not only is the national government involved, but every single state is vying to get different plants. So the state of Michigan has already put together a package of $1 billion for a battery plant that would be set up in Marshall, Michigan. It would be organized by Ford, although it uses China as its backup. And they're now asking for $750 million more. So it's only going to supposedly employ 2,500 people. It may never employ that many, but that's a huge amount of money that they're spending for each individual employee. Okay.
Right.
So that's one element of it. And of course, the UAW wants to go out and organize all of these plants. So the big question is, can we revive this notion of it's got to be mass transit? We are not going to have a technological fix, really. It's got to be a re-envisioning of our society. So yes, we can produce, and we will need some lithium, but that will be limited by the mass transit that we're producing.
Right.
And so one other thing I just want to throw in here, and that is, okay, so Nevada is far away from Detroit.
Yeah.
So what is the supply chain? For example, with oil, we've been able to have huge impacts in showing how destructive pipelines are. We have a pipeline going across the Strait of Michigan, which if it spills would be just incredible for 20% of the world's fresh water. So, and we had the biggest spill of the tar sands in Kalamazoo, Michigan, as it was coming across the state. So that's building a movement against these pipelines is certainly something that we're continuing to do. But if it's going to be through rail, are there things that we can bring up, like the oil spill with the vinyl chloride that just spilled in Ohio?
So really great. Thanks so much. I'm so glad you're here, Diane. And I want to just almost thank you for your service, right? For all of the work that you've put into being a UAW member and being in a rank and file caucus that's fighting for more progressive change within the union, and also re-envisioning what the role of auto labor is in a sort of in a new energy system, right? So just thank you for all of that. And you brought up more than I can address now, but I made a note of the auto worker caravan, and I'm going to look into it, even if it's concluded or whatever. I want to understand what it was up to, because I think that it's probably even more relevant now. And I do think that before you mentioned you were in this UAW caucus, I was going to say that, in the UAW, but also in the IBEW and the CWA, a bunch of unions that pertain to different parts of building electric vehicles, buses, batteries. There are interesting reform caucuses within those unions that are envisioning a really different transportation future from everyone gets an electric SUV. And they're doing so for different reasons, right? There are different motivations, but I think that there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. And I also think we're in a better moment right now. I mean, I don't want to sound too optimistic or like Pollyanna-ish, but there is more attention now to transit, the importance of transit. Mass transit, public transportation, the importance of walkability and cycling in our more metropolitan regions. I understand that rural landscapes might be different in a variety of ways, so I don't want to overly simplify, but there's been, cities and states that are subsidizing electric bikes, which are amazing because people can go 20 miles an hour. They can do a lot of their transportation with it. They can haul groceries because you have that battery assist, and they require so much less lithium than a car, or even per person than a bus, right? So those are great. And then electric buses, much less lithium per person than a car, et cetera, right? And so I think there's a much more conversation about this now. Young people, younger than me, like Generation Z, and I assume whatever we call the next generation, less and less interested in car ownership. They view it as financially burdensome, which it is for working class people. It's a burden, right? Cars aren't necessarily freedom, right? When you're paying the bill and when you can't maintain it and when you're stuck in traffic, right? I think that we should expand our vision of what sort of mobility justice and mobility freedom really looks like. So there's just so much to say there. I'm going to just end it with one thing that might be new to folks in the room, but you're probably aware of, just to draw it out, that, and since someone already asked about labor standards, I think something that's concerning is the fact that over the past few decades, a lot of the auto industry has moved to the South. And a lot of that is foreign and multinational car companies that have come to the US to set up shop in the US, right? And then are setting up shop in the South. Why? Because they're right to work states, a total oxymoron, like not, folks don't know, like makes it much more difficult to join a union. And so they're going there because they want to avoid the UAW, the United Auto Workers, and avoid the more union-friendly, laws of the Midwest. And so what we unfortunately have is like a lot of our growth in the auto industry, and now with battery and EV parts of the industry, is happening in non-union states. And they're hard to organize, as the UAW knows, right? And so there's a real question about labor and dignified work and what a green job means when we're not really ensuring that these are unionized jobs. And so that's a question that, I know Biden says he's concerned about, kind of, but we really need to talk about this more. So scattershot of answers, but great points, Diane, and thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Thea. Patrick?
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It feels like it's dangerous to do one of the questions where you invent a person and imagine what they're thinking, but let me do that for a second. So I have in my mind a kind of US-based progressive, and in this person, I think that when they see news of a community blocking wind power from being installed or blocking solar arrays from being connected to the grid, there's generally a negative reaction towards that. And that could be a rural community somewhere that we think votes Republican, or it could be, people in Martha's Vineyard that we expect to vote Democratic, but who don't want their views spoiled in one way or another by the wind turbines. And I think that there's often a kind of attitude, well, with this just an emergency, we need a climate transition, and we need a lot of wind towers, we need a lot of solar power, et cetera, et cetera. So why is mining different from that? If we respond skeptically, or if this person responds skeptically to the installation of those kinds of power generation technologies, that same person, I think, generally has more sympathy for the kind of communities that you're describing. And so I guess I'm wondering if you see a contradiction there, or if you don't see a contradiction, and what you would say to that, to that person.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think it's interesting. It's an interesting part of the kind of energy and climate conversation that is fraught with some simplifications that may not be helpful, which you have not been actually simplistic in what you just said, but it can go that way, right? So I'll give you the simplified version and then try to break it down a little bit and add my 2 cents. So the way that all of these types of forms of local pushback, let's just call them, like against a wind turbine, against a lithium mine, or against a new housing development, whether or not we consider that part of the climate change thing, are all referred to as NIMBY, right? The not in my backyard. And people are probably familiar with that term. The opposite is, called YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. And those terms come from the housing sector, but they've been sort of now deployed to describe the local politics of energy related build out, and as well, the local politics of the extractive piece of those supply chains. And I think that they are not that helpful, even though I actually think some people can properly be called NIMBYs. I may be in a sort of in a way that betrays my politics, kind of might reserve that term for the really wealthy person worried about their view, right? Because that really feels like you're worried about your backyard, you're sort of literal, you have a backyard, right? You have the privilege of having a backyard. You own a home with a backyard, and you're worried about what pertains to that backyard. And so that feels like, if we want to use NIMBY, I'm not always sure I even love the term, because it's such a simplifier of so many distinct things, but maybe I'll use it for them. Maybe we even think for them we should be somehow more nuanced, because I think and again, you already hinted at this, but just to say it again, when we dig into these local conflicts, when we go to the land use, the zoning councils, and we read the local reporting and X, Y, and Z, it's such a gamut. Some large percentage of the anti-renewable energy build out is funded directly or indirectly by dark money, by Koch brothers, by whatever. And that's real. And so that doesn't mean we dismiss every rural community that is concerned about something. Because then we ask, okay, well, what about, let's say this community is lower income, and let's say, sure, some of the propaganda was funded by the Koch brothers, but there's been a longstanding concern about jobs and disinvestment and like political elites not caring about them. Like, I think that's something to address, but we should disentangle that from the fact that, yes, the sort of propaganda and the Facebook groups that were created was funded by other political elites and economic elites, right? The fossil fuel ones, right? And so we can get granular. And then I think the solutions and the responses on the left or among progressives should likewise be granular and nuanced, right? I think that when we go to mining, things get a little bit different because no one, not the progressive New York Times reader who's voicing this concern, or anyone really wants a lithium mine in their backyard or next to their indigenous reservation. Like, no one really likes, okay, I'm sort of exaggerating, but fewer people like living next to mines. There are many people that actually would say, I love seeing solar panels. Like, I'm one of them, right? I mean, they don't bother me. And I'm sure there's folks in the room that are also not bothered by them. Whereas mining is hard because it's an invasive activity. It creates a lot of physical and liquid forms of waste. It contaminates. It more irreparably changes, or we might say destroys, the landscape in a way that solar panels, if they are removed, you could see landscape rehabilitation. It's hard to rehabilitate an enormous pit in the ground, right? Not impossible, but you get the idea. The stakes are a bit different. So I don't like combining them for that reason, even if there are absolutely cases where similar feelings, grievances, and motivations are at stake, right? The other thing that I worry about a little bit with your invented person is that I think I get worried when we measure climate progress by the number of lithium mines or measure climate progress by the number of EVs deployed. We should measure climate progress by the emissions cut, avoided, absorbed, whatever it is, right? Those are tools to get to that goal. But the minute we start equating those, then any lithium mine, or let's say copper mine, where copper has many end uses that don't pertain to the energy transition. So is every copper mine like a win for dealing with the climate crisis? No, right? And so I think we should be careful about how we measure success on the one hand, and then on the other hand, how we approach, govern, deal with, dialogue across like some of these conflicts that are emerging. And I think not treat them as so unique that we can't analyze them, but like do realize that there are race, class, geographic contours, and also there's different sectors with different impacts. And we should at least have like a typology where we can analyze them a bit more precisely. And I do think that it matters if the anti-mining resistance is coming from folks that were hundreds of years ago dispossessed of their land. I'm thinking of Paiute and Shoshone people in Nevada, and where the mine is being built on what they claim, and I have no reason to doubt, is a massacre site of their ancestors, right? That's like a different type of harm and thing to deal with than, again, like the Martha's Vineyard people and the wind turbines. And so that's kind of how I think about it. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, though. Good. Cool. Thanks, Patrick, so much.
Thanks so much. Thea, we have a question in the chat from Carla, who writes,
Sure.
What is your view on the emancipatory potentials of resistance movements against lithium, especially in the global north? Isn't there also a danger of reactionary movements that would rather see mining continue in the global south and externalize socio-ecological costs? I'm thinking, for example, about the influence of nationalist movements in anti-lithium struggles in Serbia.
Thank you, Carla. What a nuanced question, showing a lot of knowledge of all of these topics. So thank you for asking that. And yeah, the movement in Serbia against a Rio Tinto lithium mine, which was successful provisionally. Every success is provisional in social movement world, right? Like there is a concern that the contract will be reintroduced, or that when there's a change in government, the next government will handle things better and the mine will move forward. But for now, the mine is stalled. And so it's a success if you are on the anti-extractive side. But as Carla notes, like that movement had a lot going on. There were people that were primarily dissatisfied with the government, and this project became like a symbol of that government. There are people that have broad environmental and climate concerns, and this became a symbol of those. There's a lot of pollution and environmental degradation in Serbia, so this became kind of a symbol of more of that happening. And there were nationalist movements, as well as Carla points out. that maybe just don't like the sort of foreign capital. Rio Tinto is a global, mining company, or the relationships between that foreign company and the Serbian government. And so they're concerned about that. I think it's also Serbia is interesting because I don't know if I'd say it's global north. It sort of depends on how we define terms. It's kind of a, in classic world systems typology, we might call it like a semi-periphery. Like it's not in the EU, first of all, right? And so it doesn't benefit from some of those regulatory structures and forms of economic markets that pertain to inclusion in the EU. It wants to join it or has wanted to, depending on the government. And some parts of the population want to join it, of course. But it's a semi-periphery with a lot of environmentally destructive sectors in it. And so, the question of whether nationalism in Serbia, to the extent that certainly motivated some of the anti-lithium protests, is about shunting off costs to the global south, I think is slightly nuanced by the fact that like Serbia has this kind of liminal position in the global economy. It's not like France or Germany or the US or whatever in that regard. So that's one answer, but let me just take the substance of your question more directly. Like, yes, I think there are all sorts of dangers lurking around, meaning I absolutely think, and it tacks on really well with Patrick's question, like that there are groups opposing things, including in some cases mines, but definitely other projects out there, renewable energy projects that are motivated by things that I may find unsavory, or we may, right? Depending, or including think like, this should just happen elsewhere in the world. I don't want it near me, right? Which is not a very solidaristic kind of motivation, right? So all of that can exist. And that's why I kind of said we should take things case by case. And even as I tried to outline some broad similarities across movements, we should attend to how place-based they are or how specific they are, but also kind of, even as you're suggesting, like how their interactions with governments and corporations over time can polarize them in different ways. And so there's a lot to sort of get into there. But for me, I think what's most hopeful is that there's this increasing coordination and networking among anti-mining movements on all sides of sort of different global divides. And I think more of a concern of centering the kind of global extractive kind of complex rather than it just being about my locality, right? Or my, land or the ecosystem closest to me, kind of a global perspective of the impact of various extractive sectors, of the fact that in addressing the climate crisis, we should not reproduce like the harms of extractivism, or we should contain them as much as possible. And so I think that transnationalism of these movements is like the best guard against some of the concerns you're surfacing. But, the world is going to get increasingly complicated, chaotic, confusing as the climate crisis accelerates and as also these new forms of investment take root. And it's going to be harder to easily map kind of like ideological, there's going to be confusing ideological kind of positions that emerge, and also like sometimes uneasy bedfellows or coalition partners. And I think that, that only just requires us to be empirically grounded, but also to kind of like seek out what's the horizon of movements that are most internationalist, most global justice oriented. What are they doing? And like, how can we kind of amplify that?
Thank you so much, Thea. We'll turn to Esty for the last question of the day. Esty, go ahead.
So I wonder about the mines that already exist. As I'm sure you know, one of the big issues for indigenous peoples, and others, is the men camps that come with mining, and how they are related to the issues of murdered and missing indigenous women and indigenous peoples. And I wonder if that's what we're seeing there already, or is it local people who are employed? What are we seeing in these terms?
Yeah, so I want to kind of answer this question, and I'm aware of my 5 minutes here, so I'll be under that, or I'll leave a moment for closing out. But you sort of raised two topics there that are equally important. One is like, what is the labor situation at mines, right? How many jobs are created and who gets those jobs? That was where you went at the end. And the other piece is like, what are the implications, especially in indigenous communities where there has been an epidemic of violence against women and not unrelated to extractive industries, but also with other causes in the US and Canada. And there's been a lot of attention, and in Latin America too. Let me not exclude that. There's just been a lot of active campaigning in US and Canada around how resource extraction, by bringing in a lot of migrant and oftentimes exclusively male workers, like into already marginalized communities, creates new forms of risks and harms, and is associated again with violence, disappearances, and in some cases, of course, murders of Indigenous women, right? So those are the sort of two questions. I'll take them in the order I said them. So, a lot of the time, local communities, the main benefit for them that the mining company promises is jobs. And that's real. I don't want to downplay that, because these are economically marginalized communities that have often suffered decades of disinvestment and have seen young people leave because there's no work. And if a mining company shows up and says, we're going to build a mine, not only are we building a mine, but it's the mine of the future. Like, it's going to provide for electric vehicles. We're going to be contributing to like this important energy transition. And there's lots of jobs that are going to be created. That can be really appealing, understandably so. But I think, what often happens is the mining company talks in generalities, like 500 jobs, 200 jobs, whatever it is. And they don't break down, well, how many of those jobs do local folks already have skills for or are trainable for, right? And going to be employed in? How many of those jobs are technician jobs or managerial jobs where oftentimes folks are brought in from elsewhere? How many jobs require prior mining experience or not, right? And then, so you always get migration, both of low and high skilled labor, or I don't love low and high skilled, but you know what I mean? Like both the more entry level positions and then these sort of technical managerial positions, you get new people. And then that itself, some of that can be an economic benefit to the community. Like you have people staying in hotels, eating at restaurants. There's a whole secondary set of economic activities that can emerge. But on the other hand, as your question pointed to, a sudden influx of like migrant men without their families and social networks can also create forms of harm for women, especially Indigenous, right? And so that is a real thing that when I visited Nevada, folks at the Fort McDermott Reservation and the people of Red Mountain group were talking to me about, and they're very concerned about, and they reference man camps as a real threat. So I think, we have to kind of think about these two different issues. One is like, is mining work stable, dignified? Is there a lot of jobs? Mines are very capital intensive, tech intensive these days. And so there isn't as much work as sometimes is promised. And that work can be seasonal or just during the construction phase. And on the other hand, for the work that is created and the economic migrants that may be attracted, like how are they being integrated into the community so that there is a respect for the human rights of Indigenous people that already live there, and especially women that are so often victimized in this type of context. So, again, a few different answers to your questions, but absolutely the types of things that activists are concerned about, both the promises of jobs and also the threat of sexual violence that is unfortunately a pattern with extractive sectors.
A very powerful place to end. On behalf of the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, the Latin American, Caribbean, Iberian Studies Program, the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and the Office of Sustainability at UW-Madison, I would like to extend sincere thanks to Thea Riofrancos for a truly wonderful lecture and discussion. I would like to thank you, our audience. We hope to see both of you again very soon. Take good care. Thank you.
Thanks all. Thanks to everyone for coming and asking questions, and to Adrian and Patrick for organizing.